before the first howl ever split the sky, before kings carved their names into stone, before the moon goddess wept silver tears into the ocean, there was a prophecy. It was not written by scholars, not carved by priests. It was breathed into existence by the moon herself on the night the first Lycan rose on two legs, tilted its massive head to the heavens, and screamed its name into the dark. The words were simple, devastating, inescapable. Two shall be born of moonlight and fury. A one to rule all wolves, one to consume them, and only the mate of kings shall choose which child reigns, and which one ends the world. For centuries, the great packs dismissed it. A myth, a ghost story told to frighten pups, until a girl with storm-gray eyes stumbled into the territory of the Lycan King, until the bond snapped between them like a crack of lightning, until Raven discovered that fate does not ask permission. This is her story. This is his. And this is the story of two children whose first breath shook the mountains. If you enjoyed dark paranormal romance filled with dominant kings, hidden queens, and dangerous destiny, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Raven's scream tore through the battlefield like a war cry of the moon goddess herself. It was not a scream of fear. Raven had stopped being afraid months ago, somewhere between the first assassination attempt and the third, but this scream was different. This was pain, raw, animal, ancient as the cold itself. Lucian froze mid-shift. His half-wolf form was already terrifying, 8 feet of muscle and claw and barely contained fury, his dark fur matted with blood that wasn't entirely his own. He had been tearing through Cedric's rogue soldiers like paper when the sound hit him. His mate's voice, in agony. Every other sound dropped away. The clash of steel, the growls of shifting wolves, the distant thunder of dark magic cracking across the horizon. All of it, gone. There was only her, writhing in the snow. One hand pressed to her swollen belly, blood, too much blood, spreading beneath her like a dark halo. "She's in labor!" Thalos shouted from somewhere behind him, his voice nearly swallowed by the chaos of battle. "Lucian, she's in labor! It's too soon!" Lucian didn't answer. He was already moving. A blur of dark fur and ancient power, the Lycan King tore across the battlefield like a living storm. Warriors scattered before him. Allies pressed themselves flat against the ground. Enemies simply ceased to be obstacles. One rogue soldier raised a silver-tipped spear and had barely a second to regret it before Lucian ripped it from his hands and left him 10 feet behind without breaking stride. "Move!" he roared, and the battlefield obeyed. Raven cried out again. The sound did something to his chest that no silver blade ever had. It shattered something. He crashed to his knees beside her in the snow, the cold soaking into his skin instantly. His massive clawed hands, still halfway between human and wolf, gathered her trembling body with terrifying gentleness. The contrast should have been absurd. The most feared creature on this continent, cradling a woman like she was made of moonlight. Which she was. That was the whole problem. Her eyes found his. Storm gray and blazing. Pain and fury and something ferocious underneath it all. "They're coming," she gasped. "I can feel them." "Not yet," Lucian said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraping past his fangs. "Not here. Not like this." "They're not waiting," Raven said through clenched teeth, "and neither am I." Her body convulsed, and then the runes appeared. Ancient silver symbols erupted across Raven's skin like fire beneath parchment. They spread from her collarbone to her wrists, tracing paths that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Not burns, not wounds. Living light, moving with her breath, bright as molten moonlight poured into flesh. The battlefield fell silent. Not because anyone ordered it, because every creature with wolf blood, friend or enemy, shifted or not, felt it in their bones. Something old had woken up, something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time. But lightning split the sky directly above them, a single savage crack of white silver that turned the frozen battlefield to stark shadow and blazing light. The ground trembled. Cedric's soldiers stopped fighting mid-swing. Even Cedric himself, standing 20 yards away with his blade dripping, went still. Raven screamed again, and then 2 cries echoed across the mountains. Not soft, not small, not the tentative first sounds of newborns finding their lungs for the first time. They were howls, primal, powerful, ancient as the first moon, rolling outward like thunder across the peaks, bouncing back, doubled, tripled, until the whole world seemed to vibrate with it. Lucian looked down. 2 infants lay against Raven's chest, their eyes already open, already glowing, silver like starlight trapped behind glass. Twins, Thalos whispered. He had appeared beside them without Lucian noticing. His face had gone the color of old ash. Moon-born twins. Lucian's heart thundered. The prophecy had begun, but so had something far more dangerous, because across the silent battlefield, through the drifting snow and the frozen clash of armies, Cedric was smiling. The prophecy awakens. No one moved. Hundreds of wolves, Lucian's pack, the rogue soldiers, even the dark things that had crawled out of the tree line, stood in frozen tableau. Weapons lowered, claws retracted. Every eye on the 2 small shapes cradled in Raven's arms, because every wolf present could feel it. Power like none of them had ever encountered. Old as the first moon, heavy as a mountain, quiet as the moment before a storm breaks, emanating from 2 newborns who shouldn't have existed. Lucian held Raven closer, curving his body around her and the children like a living wall. His fur was still half raised. His claws, slowly retracting, had left gouges in the frozen earth. "Are they safe?" Raven whispered. Her voice was threadbare, hollowed out by exhaustion and pain, but her eyes were fierce as ever. She was cataloging every threat in the vicinity even now. His mate, his impossible mate. He looked down at the twins. A boy. Darker featured, serious even in those first impossible minutes, his tiny fist already gripping Raven's cloak with surprising strength. A girl. Paler. Eyes cycling through expressions too complex for a creature minutes old. A silver light tracing the lines of the tiny runes already forming on her wrists. "They're strong," Lucian said quietly. The words felt insufficient. What he meant was, "They are terrifying." What he meant was, "I have never been afraid of anything in 300 years of life, and I am afraid now." What he meant was, "I would burn this entire world down before I let anyone touch them." Thalos crouched beside them. Lucian's oldest advisor, the pack's keeper of lore, had survived wars that predated the current age. His expression, usually carved from calm, had cracked entirely. He was staring at the twins with something close to reverence, and something much closer to dread. "This isn't just the prophecy," he said slowly, carefully, the way a man handles a weapon he doesn't fully understand. "It's older than the prophecy. This is the source." "Thalos," Lucian's voice carried warning, "speak plainly. The prophecy described an event. These children are the event." He exhaled. "I've been studying the texts for 20 years. I never understood why the moon chose to speak through them until this moment." His eyes swept from the boy to the girl and back again. "They're not just powerful, they're complementary. 2 halves of something that's supposed to be whole." "Supposed to be?" Thalos opened his mouth, and Cedric laughed. The sound cut across the silent battlefield like a blade, clear, delighted, and entirely wrong in this moment. It was the laugh of a man who had been waiting for something and had finally watched it arrive. "Finally," the rogue Alpha said. He walked forward through the snow without hurry, his golden eyes catching the silver light still pulsing from the twins. His armor was drenched in blood, much of it belonging to Lucian's warriors. His blade, an ancient thing etched with runes that shouldn't have existed outside the darkest histories, rested loosely in his grip. We'd 20 years of searching, losing pack after pack to your border patrols, Lucian. 20 years of setbacks and delays and dead ends. He tilted his head. The madness in his eyes was pure, unclouded, almost beautiful in its completeness. And all I had to do was wait for your mate to deliver them to me. Lucian rose. Slowly. The air around him changed. It always did when the Lycan King reached his limit. It thickened, darkened. Nagus became charged with something primal that pressed against every wolf in the vicinity like a physical force. Even Cedric took an involuntary step back. "You will not take another step," Lucian said. Not a threat. A fact, stated with the calm certainty of a man who has ended civilizations and remembers doing it. Cedric stopped, considered, then smiled wider. "Oh, Lucian, you misunderstand." He raised his blade. The runes on it blazed suddenly, dark, red-edged, wrongly lit. "I'm not here to take them," Cedric said pleasantly. The lightning struck again, closer this time. The mountain groaned. "I'm here to kill them." The ground shattered beneath Lucian's feet. One moment he was standing over Raven and the twins. The next, he was across the battlefield, moving faster than anything his size had any right to move, covering 30 yards in less than a breath. The sound of his impact shook snow from the surrounding tree line. He hit Cedric like a mountain falling. The two wolves tore into each other with centuries of violence between them. This was not the disciplined combat of generals. This was primal, savage, deeply personal. The collision of two apex predators who had been circling each other for decades and finally had no reason left to hold back. Cedric was fast. He had always been fast, had trained for this specific confrontation with fanatical dedication, for he had taken enhancements from sources that would have horrified any wolf who knew what he'd sacrificed. His blade carved arcs of dark magic through the air, each one carving into Lucian's skin and refusing to heal at normal speed. Silver. Old silver. The kind that had been spoken over, but Lucian was rage given form. He absorbed the cuts and gave back devastation. Each blow from the Lycan King landed with enough force to buckle armor, to crack the frozen ground where Cedric was driven into it, to leave craters in the earth that slowly filled with snow. "I've waited for this fight!" Cedric roared, his golden eyes blazing as he drove his blade toward Lucian's throat. Lucian caught the blade between his palms. The silver burned. He didn't flinch. "Then you waited for your death," Lucian said, and broke it. Behind them, Thalos had formed a perimeter around Raven and the twins with 6 of the most trusted Lycan warriors. They held their positions with the particular stillness of people trying very hard not to look as frightened as they felt. Raven was trying to stand. She had gotten as far as one knee before Thalos put a firm hand on her shoulder. "Don't. I can fight." "You just gave birth on a battlefield," he said. "You cannot fight." She hated that he was right. She could feel it in her own body, the depletion, the wrongness of having spent so much power so quickly. The runes on her skin were fading slowly, draining back to invisibility, taking with them the heat that had kept her warm even in the snow. The twins were quiet in her arms, watching. Their silver eyes tracked movement with an intelligence that was unsettling in creatures so new to existence. And then the wind shifted. Raven felt it before she smelled it. A change in temperature that had nothing to do with weather. Cold that was intentional, directed. The kind that arrived when something old and dark decided to enter a space. Her eyes snapped to the forest. "Thalos, I see it." The tree line had eyes. Hundreds of them, red as coals, unblinking, patient. They came out of the forest one by one, and they were wrong in the way that only things touched by corrupted magic can be wrong. Their fur was the black of places where light simply doesn't go. Not dark gray, not charcoal, the absolute void black of the space between stars. It had seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, so that they moved across the snow like holes cut in reality, like shapes that shouldn't be there. Their limbs were too long, their joints bent at angles that suggested something had remade their skeletons without fully understanding how wolf anatomy was supposed to work. They didn't breathe, or if they did, they breathed the wrong direction. "Shadow wolves," Thalos said. His voice had the flatness of someone reciting words from a book they'd hoped was fiction. "They haven't been seen since the second culling, 300 years ago." Raven counted them, lost count, started again. "How many?" "Too many." But it wasn't the shadow wolves themselves that made the air suddenly impossible to breathe. It was who walked between them, tall, unhurried, dressed in robes so dark they seemed to be made from the night itself, a layered and flowing and wrong in that same fundamental way as the wolves. The figure moved with the practiced grace of someone who had never once in their long life worried about anything in their path getting in the way, because nothing ever had. Their face was hidden behind a silver mask, not ornamental, not ceremonial, but functional, deliberately obscuring. The surface was etched with runes that Raven recognized from the texts Thalos had shown her during her months in the Lycan library, as ancient symbols, words in a language that predated the common tongue by millennia. She could translate fragments. What she could translate made her hold the twins tighter. The masked figure stopped at the edge of the battlefield, did not raise their voice, did not need to. When they spoke, the words simply were, present in every ear simultaneously, bypassing sound entirely. "Kill the king," the figure said. The shadow wolves tensed as one. "And bring me the children." Everything erupted. The shadow pack surged forward with terrifying synchronicity, not the chaotic charge of wolves driven by bloodlust, but the coordinated advance of creatures operating with a single mind. They moved in formation, splitting around obstacles, flowing into gaps in the defensive line with liquid precision. Lucian's warriors met them with everything they had. It wasn't enough. Normal wolves, even trained Lycan warriors, were built for combat with things that followed the expected rules. You read their movement, you countered their strikes, you exploited the physics of bodies made from flesh and bone and adrenaline. Shadow wolves didn't follow the rules. A claw that should have connected passed through smoke. A jaw aimed at a throat closed on nothing. A silver-tipped spear that was definitely embedded in dark flank simply came out the other side without resistance. The shadow wolf continuing forward as though nothing had touched it. Then it would be real, solid. Claws connecting, fangs finding purchase, doing damage that was entirely permanent. And then not real again. Shifting. Flickering between states of matter with no apparent effort. The warriors holding the line around Raven were bleeding. Some had gone down. The perimeter was shrinking. Lucian felt it through the mate bond, that blazing, invisible thread that connected him to Raven in ways that went beyond sensation, beyond communication, into something that operated at the level of the soul. He felt the tightening, felt the danger. He ripped his attention from Cedric, who was still fighting, still laughing, blade replaced with pure dark magic channeled through his arms, and tried to assess the perimeter. The masked figure hadn't moved, just watched, patient as geology. And Lucian understood, suddenly and completely, what this had always been. Not a battle, a distraction. Cedric hadn't come to win. He'd come to occupy the one being on this field capable of holding back the shadow pack. He'd come to keep Lucian's attention on golden eyes and dark magic, while the real threat walked out of a forest. He was already moving back toward Raven when he saw it. One shadow wolf, smaller than the others, moving low along the ground. Beneath the line of engagement, Beneath notice, heading directly for Raven, Thalos was fighting two others. The remaining warriors were occupied. Raven saw it, but she couldn't move. The shadow wolf gathered itself, launched. Raven saw the claws coming. She turned her body, tried to shield the twins with whatever she had left, muscle and bone, and the stubborn refusal to let anything happen to them, because she was their mother, and mothers don't stop, not even when they're empty. Not even when they're broken. Not even on a battlefield in a snowstorm with a shadow wolf in midair and no one close enough to stop it. The twins opened their eyes. Both of them. At the same moment, with the same expression, not surprise, not fear, not the instinctive squinting of newborns overwhelmed by sensation. An expression of ancient, total calm. The expression of beings who have always known this moment was coming and have been waiting for it with infinite patience. Silver light erupted. It was not a flash, not a burst, not an explosion in any physical sense. It expanded outward from the twins like a wave, visible but not blinding, felt in the chest like a bell struck at the exact frequency of the soul. Every creature on the battlefield experienced it differently. Lucian's warriors described it later as warmth, as rightness, as the feeling of finally coming home after a very long journey. Cedric's rogues described it as pain, not physical but something deeper, like being shown something true and discovering you've wasted your entire existence. The shadow wolves simply ceased, not destroyed, not dispersed, ceased, as though the silver light looked at them and quietly pointed out that they had never been supposed to exist, and the shadow wolves, confronted with this truth, simply agreed. One moment there were dozens, then there were none. The snow where they had stood was undisturbed. The battlefield fell absolutely silent. Lucian stopped moving. Cedric stopped fighting. Every wolf still standing went still, not frozen by fear or magic, but by something that bypassed those mechanisms entirely and spoke directly to the most fundamental part of them, the part that had been created by moonlight and still remembered it. The twins were glowing. The boy raised one hand, small enough to fit in Lucian's palm, a fingers no larger than a wolf's claw, and the sky cracked. Not lightning this time, something that lightning was trying to approximate. The actual original thing that lightning was an imitation of, white silver and total, and it illuminated every face on the field without shadows. The girl opened her mouth. What came out was not a cry. It was a howl. Not the howl of a pup. Not the sound of something small discovering its lungs. The howl of an alpha speaking to the moon, a calling in a debt that had been owed since the first night. Full and layered and resonating in frequencies the human ear couldn't fully process, but the wolf mind received completely. It rolled across the mountains, bounced back, doubled, echoed into silence, and somewhere very far away something ancient heard it, and began to wake. The masked figure was the first to speak. They had not moved during the extinction of the shadow pack, had not reacted to the silver light or the howl or the thunder crack. They stood exactly as they had been standing, at the edge of the battlefield, robes pooling around them, silver mask reflecting nothing, as though they had watched events like this before and found them less surprising than others did. "Yes," the figure said, soft, almost pleased, exactly as the prophecy said. Lucian positioned himself between the figure and his family. His injuries were significant. The silver cuts from Cedric's blade mapped across his chest and arms in lines that blazed with slow fire. But he stood straight, and his eyes held the particular quality that had made 3 continents of wolves decide that surrender was an acceptable option. "What prophecy?" he said. The figure tilted their head. "Not the one your advisor keeps in his library," they said. "The real one. The original. Written before the moon decided to make it simple enough for wolves to memorize." Thalos had gone very still beside Raven. "There's another text," he said slowly. "I've been looking for it for 40 years. "It wasn't lost," the figure said. It was kept. The wind howled across the battlefield, carrying snow and the smell of old blood. The version your packs know speaks of power, the masked figure continued. Two born of moonlight, one to rule. It's elegant, manageable. It's the version that keeps wolf kings from hunting the prophesied children on sight. A pause. The complete version is less comfortable. Tell me, Lucian said. The figure looked at the twins. Something passed behind the silver mask. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. Two children born of moonlight and fury, the figure said. One destined to bind the packs, to become what Lycans were always meant to be before they fractured into kings and territories and politics. A true alpha absolute, the apex of what your kind can achieve. Silence. And the other? Raven asked. The figure was quiet for a moment that stretched. The other is the cost, they said. Every apex predator has a predator above it. Every apex of power has a ceiling. The child who does not ascend to the throne becomes something else, something that balances the equation. Something that destroys it, Thalos said. His voice had gone hollow. Not out of malice, out of design. The moon is a mathematician. She doesn't create peaks without creating valleys. Lucian's jaw was tight enough to crack stone. Which one? The figure looked between the two children. For the first time, they sounded almost like a person. We don't know, they said. The prophecy doesn't specify. It can't. The designation isn't made at birth. It's made by choice, by circumstance, by the 1,000 small decisions that happen between this moment and the moment of ascension. Lucian stared. That's why you want them, Raven said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Not to kill them, to control which one becomes which. The figure was silent. Which was answer enough. By the time the sun rose over the mountains, the battlefield was silent in the way that only places that have witnessed tremendous things can be silent. Full of it. Saturated with the residue of what had occurred. Cedric had vanished, slipped away during the chaos of the Shadow Wolves' extinction, which was, Lucian reflected, entirely characteristic. Cedric had never stayed for conclusions. He appeared at the moments he calculated most advantageous and disappeared before the accounting. The masked figure had gone with him, or separately. No one could say when or how. One moment they had been standing at the edge of the field, and then the space they had occupied was simply empty. The remaining rogue soldiers had surrendered or fled. The ones who surrendered were on their knees in the snow, eyes down, waiting to discover whether the Lycan King's mercy was a real thing. He had not yet decided. Lucian carried Raven back to the castle himself, refusing every offer of assistance. She had stopped arguing by the third offer, which meant she was more exhausted than she wanted to admit. The twins were nestled against her chest, one in each arm, their silver eyes open and tracking everything with unnerving attention. They passed through the castle gates as the morning light turned the stone walls gold. The entire pack had gathered. Hundreds of wolves. The pack's elders and warriors, the families who had sheltered within the castle walls during the battle, the pups who had been told to stay inside and had not. They lined the path from the gates to the great doors in total silence, and as Lucian walked between them with Raven and the twins, the wolves lowered their heads. One by one, then in waves, until every wolf in the courtyard had bowed, not to the Lycan King, to the children. Lucian felt something complicated pass through him. Pride, terror, the specific ache of a person who loves something so completely that the knowledge of its danger is a constant low-grade wound. He kept walking. In the throne room, Thalos spread the ancient scrolls across the great table. He had been working since before they returned, sending urgent messages through the pack's network, pulling texts from the deep archive that hadn't been opened in his lifetime. What he was finding was not reassuring. Raven sat in the chair nearest the fire, the one Lucian had placed there months ago. when she had first arrived and refused to sit in any chair that felt like it belonged to a queen, with the twins in a basket at her feet. She had washed the battlefield from her skin, changed clothes. She still looked like someone who had won a war by the thinnest margin, but she was awake and present and watching Thalos with the focused attention she gave everything she didn't yet understand. "Tell me what you've found," she said. Not a request. Thalos straightened from the scrolls and looked at the twins, then looked at Lucian, then at the fire, as though hoping the flames had a better option. "There's something the prophecy didn't mention," he said. "Something that might be considered a mercy, except that it isn't, really, when you understand the implications." "Thalos," Lucian said, "the twins aren't just powerful independently, they're connected, tied together in a way that goes beyond twin bond, beyond blood, beyond what we'd normally understand as a relationship between siblings." He paused. "The power that emanated from them tonight, what you saw, what we all felt, that was the combined output, both of them, together, pulling from the same source." "And if they're separated?" Raven asked. Thalos set down the scroll he was holding. "They're diminished, both of them. Still extraordinary but manageable. The combined power is what makes them what the prophecy describes." He folded his hands. "But there's something worse." Raven had gone very still. "If one dies," Thalos said carefully, "the other receives everything. All the power, all the potential, undivided." He let that sit. The child that remains becomes the complete prophecy. Both destinies folded into one being. Silence descended on the throne room like a physical presence. The fire crackled. The twins slept. And Lucian understood why Cedric had been smiling on the battlefield. "You didn't need to control which twin ascended to what destiny. You just needed to kill one and let nature handle the rest. They named them at midnight. Not in ceremony, not with the assembled pack and the ancient rites that the traditions demanded. There would be time for that, or there wouldn't, and it wouldn't matter. But in the immediate present, in the quiet of the chamber where the fire had burned down to coals and the castle around them had finally gone silent, Lucian and Raven sat together with their children between them and spoke the names that had been forming in the spaces between crisis and battle and impossible prophecy. The boy, Caius, named for the first Lycan who had ever walked upright, who had stood on a mountainside 3,000 years ago and decided that pack meant something, that bond meant something, that there was a difference between strength used to take and strength used to protect. The girl, Selene, for the moon herself, for the thing that had made them, marked them, sent them into the world in a burst of silver light on a battlefield in the snow because apparently the moon had opinions about timing. Caius opened one dark eye when his name was spoken, considered it, seemed to find it acceptable. Selena already appeared to have known her name. Raven looked at them in the firelight and felt something slot into place in her chest that she hadn't known was missing. "They're going to be fine," she said. Not because she believed it completely, but because she had decided it, and Raven's decisions had a way of becoming true through sheer application of will. Lucian looked at her. This woman, who had stumbled into his territory 9 months ago, disrupted 3 centuries of carefully maintained order, and proceeded to permanently alter the trajectory of everything he'd thought he understood about his life. His mate, his storm, his impossible, irreplaceable, infuriating, extraordinary mate. "They're going to be fine," he agreed. He meant it. He had decided it too. And Lucian's decisions had a way of becoming true through completely different means, usually involving substantial destruction, but the outcome was generally similar. He stayed awake while Raven slept, held both twins in his arms, something Thalos would have found deeply undignified in the Lycan King, and Lucian found he couldn't care less about, and thought. About the masked figure, about Cedric, about prophecies that had been only half told, about what was coming. Caius was awake, dark eyes steady in the dimness, watching his father's face with an attention that was entirely too adult for a creature hours old. Lucian studied him back. "I will not let them touch you," he said quietly. "Not a promise, a fact." Caius reached up and curled his tiny fingers around one of Lucian's, and Lucian, for the first time in 300 years, understood what the word defenseless actually meant, and not the absence of power, the presence of something you could lose. 3 days later, the council came. They arrived in force, the alphas of the 7 great packs, trailing their seconds and thirds, and in 2 cases their entire inner circles, filling the great hall of Lucian's castle with the particular uncomfortable energy of powerful beings who would very much prefer to be anywhere else, but have decided that showing up is tactically necessary. The Iron Fang Alpha, the Ashwood Alpha, the Coastal Packs, the Northern Packs, the Deepwood clan who hadn't attended a council in 30 years and whose presence alone indicated how seriously they were taking the situation. They had all felt the power on the night of the battle. Word traveled fast among wolves. What they had felt traveled faster. Some knowledge bypasses language and moves directly through the blood. They wanted answers. They wanted assurances. Several of them, though none would say it directly yet, wanted control of the situation. Lucian received them in the great hall with Thalos at his right hand and the empty throne at his back. Raven was present. She had insisted. The twins were not. This, Lucian had also insisted, the Iron Fang Alpha, a thick-necked wolf named Brennan who had held his territory by outsurviving 3 assassination attempts and 2 wars, spoke first. "The Shadow Pack hasn't been seen in 3 centuries, he said. "Every account we have says they were bound. Permanently. What broke them free?" "The better question," said the Ashwood Alpha Mira, who was small and pale and approximately as dangerous as a drawn blade, "is who commanded them. Shadow wolves don't serve masters. They haven't in recorded history." "They served last night," Thalos said. The room settled into the kind of silence that precedes difficult truths. "We don't know who the masked figure is," Lucian said. He offered no apology for this ignorance. Information was a resource like any other, and absence of it was simply a current state, not a failure. "We know they have access to magic that shouldn't exist, that they were tracking the prophecy, and that their objective is the twins." "Which means our objective is the same as theirs," Brennan said, "whether we like it or not." The temperature in the room dropped. "Clarify that," Raven said. Her voice was entirely pleasant. Bob Brennan looked at her with the expression of a man who has not fully updated his beliefs about what she is. "The children are a strategic matter. They affect all 7 packs." "They are my children," Raven said. "They affect me, my husband, the people we choose to trust with their safety. The rest of you are guests in this castle who will be provided with tea and whatever information we decide is appropriate." The silence that followed had a different quality. Lucian said nothing, which was, several alphas noted, its own form of statement. After the council departed, some satisfied, most unsettled, all aware that the conversation had only been delayed rather than concluded, Thalos asked to speak with them privately. He had found the second text. Not in the archive, not in any conventional place. It had been in the oldest part of the castle library, a section so neglected it had technically ceased to be categorized as a library and had begun its slow transition into becoming a wall. He had found it behind a stone that the castle's original builders had decided was a better hiding place than a shelf, which in retrospect was exactly the kind of choice made by people who understood how seriously the text needed to be hidden. It was a thin document, barely 12 pages, written in a hand that predated the current script, in a language that was only partially comprehensible even to Thalos, who read 7 dead tongues fluently. What he could read was enough. He placed it on the table between them. Raven looked at the open page, looked at Thalos. "Tell me," she said. The Moonborn twins, Thalos said, are not simply powerful individuals. They're a mechanism. The prophecy, the full version, describes them as a key. Two parts of something that, when joined, either opens a door or permanently seals it. A door to what? Thalos turned the page, showed them a diagram that had been drawn in ink so old it had nearly faded to nothing. Two figures standing on either side of a circular symbol Raven recognized as the moon seal, the oldest representation of the compact between wolves and the moon. The divide between what wolves are and what they were intended to become, he said, before the first fracture. Before the packs split and the territories formed and everyone decided that boundaries were more important than origin. He traced the diagram carefully. When wolves were one people, before the kings, before the wars, when the moon's children were actually that, a single family under a single sky. Raven sat back slowly. Caius and Selene are supposed to reunify the packs, she said. One of them is, the other... Thalos closed the text gently. The other is what happens if the reunification fails, if the door is opened and then slammed shut, if the attempt is made and broken. He paused. The text calls it the reckoning. It's not malice. It's consequence. If wolves cannot unite, the moon withdraws her protection, and the thing that fills that absence is not kind. Silence. So the masked figure, Lucian said slowly. They don't just want to control which child ascends to which destiny. They want to ensure the reunification fails, Thalos said, so the reckoning is guaranteed. He looked out the window. I don't know why yet. I don't know what they gain from it, but that's the shape of their goal. Raven looked at the twins, Caius, who gripped things with terrifying conviction, Selene, who already seemed to be listening to conversations she shouldn't be able to understand. She had made her decision on a battlefield 3 days ago. She made it again now. They would not fail. She didn't know how to guarantee that yet, but she was very good at figuring things out. That night, Lucian stood alone on the highest battlement of the castle. He did this sometimes. Raven had noticed it in the months since they had bonded. This need to place himself at the highest available point and look at the territory below. She had initially assumed it was strategic, the alpha's instinct to survey and assess. She understood now that it was something older than strategy. Grief, maybe, the particular weight carried by things that have outlived most of what they loved. He was 312 years old. He had been king for 280 of those years. He had built this castle, stone by stone, from the ruins of the original structure that had stood here when he was young. He remembered what had stood here before that. He had fought in the wars that had made the current landscape of pack territories. He had attended the funerals of wolves who had died fighting at his side, whose grandchildren had died fighting at his side, whose great-grandchildren were down below right now, probably sleeping after the battle. This was what power at his level actually felt like. Not strength, accumulation. The weight of everything you'd seen and done and lost pressed flat and carried so long it had become invisible, but inseparable from your own nature. He heard Raven on the stairs before she appeared, her heartbeat, her particular rhythm, the way she moved differently than she had 9 months ago, something in her gait adjusted by experience and motherhood, and the fact that she had stood on a battlefield and made choices that most wolves never had to make. She stood beside him without speaking for a while, looking out at the dark territory below, the forest, vast and ancient, the mountains, indifferent, the sky full of stars around a moon that had opinions. "You're thinking about your brother," she said. Lucian went still. He had told her about Aldrich exactly once, in the way you tell someone something that has been sealed behind stone for 2 centuries. Briefly, factually, with the practiced control of a man who has made peace with something he will never actually be at peace with. His twin, his other half. Dead at 17 in the First Great War, long before Lucian was a king. Why, when they were both still young enough to believe that power would protect what they loved. The parallel had not escaped him. The prophecy describes something I've already lived, he said. His voice was even. It cost him. Not exactly, Raven said. Close enough. She didn't argue. She turned to face him instead. And in the moonlight, her storm-gray eyes held the kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with not being afraid and everything to do with having decided that fear was an unaffordable luxury. They have what you and Aldrich didn't, she said. What? Us. The simplicity of it hit him somewhere that 3 centuries of survival instinct hadn't fully armored. He looked at her. She looked back. The mate bond hummed between them, warm and complex and permanent. No, he reached out and pulled her close. She let him. They stood together on the battlement under the moon that had made their children and complicated everything. And for a few minutes there was no prophecy, no masked figures, no councils or shadow pacts or decisions not yet made. Just the two of them, and the stars, and the quiet understanding that the future was coming regardless, and they would face it as they faced everything. Together. 3 months passed. They were not peaceful months. Peace, Raven had concluded, was not a state that the universe intended to allow this particular family for any extended period. But they were functional months, months in which things were accomplished, alliances were tested and strengthened, the castle's defenses were redesigned from the ground up by someone who understood that shadow wolves required unconventional countermeasures. Thalos, with help from 3 imported scholars who had been sworn to silence on threat of consequences, they seemed to believe Lucian was capable of delivering, decoded another 2 pages of the second text. The twins grew with the particular intensity of children who had arrived with somewhere to be. Caius was walking at 6 weeks, not stumbling, not pulling himself up, and immediately falling. Walking, with focus, crossing the room to reach something he had decided he wanted, and then standing over it with an expression of complete satisfaction. Lucian had watched this with an expression Raven had categorized as extremely proud and also very concerned. Selene was speaking at 8 weeks, single words at first, then short phrases, then complete sentences spoken with the clarity of a much older child. But what concerned Thalos, and delighted Raven in the specific way that things that should be concerning sometimes land as fascinating, was what she was saying. She was answering questions that hadn't been asked, responding to conversations that were happening in the next room, and twice, once in front of witnesses, correcting Thalos's translation of the second text before he'd said it aloud. "She's reading ahead," Thalos had said. "Reading ahead of what?" Raven had asked. Thalos had looked at the infant. "Time," he had said, with the tone of someone who had not previously believed that sentence could apply to a 3-month-old. The first sign came on a Tuesday, not heralded by lightning, not announced by the howl of wolves or the crack of ancient magic across the sky. It came quietly, the way the worst things often do. A border patrol didn't come back. 12 wolves, experienced warriors, a route they had run for years without incident, through territory that had been quiet since the battle. They simply weren't there when they were supposed to be. The search teams found them 6 hours later, alive. All 12 of them. Standing in a clearing in the forest, perfectly still, eyes open but seeing nothing, arranged in a circle facing outward. In the center of the circle, drawn in the frozen earth, the symbol from the masked figure's robe. The same runes Raven had read on the battlefield, but this time she could translate all of them. Because Selene had taught her, in the particular indirect way she communicated things she wanted known, not by saying it, but by sitting near the texts and humming until Raven looked up and understood. The runes said, "We are watching." The runes said, "We are patient." The runes said, "The children are almost ready." Far away, beneath a mountain that had no name on any current map, because the civilization that had named it had ceased to exist before memory began. Nays beneath a ruined temple whose architecture predated the wolf packs, predated the moon compact, predated every story that wolves told themselves about their own origins. In a chamber carved from living rock by hands that had not been human. Cedric knelt. The posture did not suit him. He was a creature built for dominance, physically and temperamentally, and the bowing of his head went against something fundamental in his architecture. But he knelt because the alternative, standing, by meeting that silver-masked gaze as equals, was an option that his instincts flatly refused. You didn't stand before this. You knelt, and you were grateful for the mercy of not being asked to crawl. You failed, the masked figure said. No inflection, no anger, just the statement, laid down like a stone. Not entirely. Cedric reached into his armor and produced a small glass vial. Inside it, a single strand of silver hair. 3 months old, untaken in the chaos of the battlefield when he had been close enough to Raven to reach her, when his blade had grazed her shoulder and taken this with it. He had been careful with it, more careful than he had been with anything in his life. He understood now what it was worth. He placed it on the stone altar before him. The masked figure looked at it for a long moment. Good, they said. They reached out, gloved hand, the gloves the same dark material as the robes, every inch of skin perpetually hidden, and lifted the vial with the care of a person handling a live coal, turned it in the dim light. In the chamber's darkness, the strand of hair glowed faintly. Silver, like a fragment of moon trapped in glass. Dark magic moved across the chamber, not like lightning, not like the sharp, dramatic crackle of power wielded in combat. This was different, slow, deliberate, old. The magic of things that have been patient for so long that patience has become its own form of power. It gathered around the vial, coiled, sank in, and then the strand of hair changed, still glowing, but differently now, branching, multiplying, becoming a map of something, a signature, a key. Now we can begin, the masked figure said. Cedric looked up. In the months since the battle, he had used the time usefully, rebuilt his inner circle. I established new contacts among the pack alphas who were more frightened of the twins' existence than loyal to the Lycan King, mapped the castle's new defenses using informants he was confident hadn't yet been identified. He had plans. He was very good at plans. But even he, with his cultivated madness and his absolute conviction in his own purpose, felt the particular unease of the next question. What about the children? He asked. They're developing faster than any record suggests. The girl, Celine, she's already showing abilities that shouldn't appear for years. If we wait much longer to act, we wait, the masked figure said. The window is closing. The window, the figure said, is exactly where we need it to be. They turned, and Cedric's voice stopped in his throat. He had been in this chamber 6 times now. He had noticed the door on his 3rd visit, a massive thing, carved from a single piece of stone so ancient it had fossilized, and etched with runes that made his skin crawl when he read them. He had asked about it once, carefully, and been answered with silence so complete it functioned as a warning. He had not asked again, but the door was different tonight. Before, it had been still, a presence, oppressive and patient, but still. Tonight it breathed, not metaphorically. The stone itself moved, infinitesimal expansions and contractions in and out, regular as a sleeping chest. And from behind it, a sound, low, continuous, not mechanical, organic, like tectonic plates grinding, like the sound of deep roots growing, like something enormous remembering that it exists. What is that? Cedric whispered. The masked figure looked at the door. And in the silver mask, something that might have been anticipation. Let them grow, the figure said. Let them become strong. Let the Lycan King believe he has time to prepare. Let Raven believe her children will be safe. They paused. And when the time comes, when the twins are powerful enough that their combined strength can complete what this requires. The stone door trembled. The grinding sound grew. The walls of the ancient chamber vibrated with it. The unlit torches rattled in their brackets. The altar cracked down its center, a clean line, perfectly straight, as though something had simply decided the stone should be 2 pieces now. We'll release the one thing even the moon goddess fears. Behind the door, something roared. It was not a wolf's roar. It was not the sound of a beast or a creature or anything that had a name in any living language. It was the sound of a concept given voice, of something that existed before names were invented, before wolves walked upright, before the moon decided she had opinions about the creatures she'd made. It rolled outward from the chamber in waves, through solid stone, or through miles of mountain, outward into the cold night air. It reached the castle. In her chambers, Celine woke. Her silver eyes opened in the dark, and for the first time in 3 months of life, she looked afraid. Caius was awake too. His hand found his sister's in the dark. They held on, and the mountain, hundreds of miles away, trembled. End of Part 1. Mated to the Lycan King, Part 2, The Reckoning Coming.